We are officially in semifinals week of your guys' fantasy football leagues. It is go time. It is time to punch your ticket towards that fantasy football championship. And today I got you guys covered with my top 30 wide receiver rankings in the tier list format I bring you guys every week, going through my wide receiver 1s, my wide receiver 2s, my wide receiver 3s, and my 5 favorite deep flex plays. If you guys enjoy, make sure you leave a like down below. Comment your biggest start-sit decision. Like I said, it is go time. You need to win this week. Secure your championship bid. I will try to get to as many as possible. And of course, if you are new, hit that subscribe button. We are on the road to 40,000. I appreciate you guys for that continued support. But with that being said, let's get right into it. All right, before I get into the official top 30, we go through the will they play tier. You guys know the criteria by now, but if you guys are new, general thumb for these guys is we'd like to see at least one full practice between today or tomorrow. And if not, I would lean towards a lower ranked counterpart. But the guys on the will they play tier this week happen to be Tyreek Hill, Keenan Allen, Devontae Smith, Nico Collins, Chris Godwin, and Jaden Reed. So let's just start this off right off the bat with Keenan Allen. Was already ruled out for this week's games. Tough blow, obviously a big-time fantasy player this year. But with Justin Herbert's sideline, it really does not make sense for the Chargers to rush him back. So I do understand their decision of keeping Keenan Allen out. But of course, this guy's been a top 10 wide receiver all year. So if you do have Keenan Allen, you are going to be in a tough blow considering that he will not be suiting up this week. Tyreek Hill, wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins, obviously the big-time name on this list this week, did not play in last week's game. However, if you do have Tyreek Hill, more than likely that you were able to secure the bye week. But you will need him to suit up this week. Still dealing with that ankle sprain, was a limited participant in practice on Thursday, and it really sounds like he's going to be playing. Mike McDaniel sounds like he doesn't have many concerns in regards to Tyreek Hill's playing status. If he does play, he is the wide receiver 1 overall on this week's slate. Big-time matchup against my beloved Dallas Cowboys over on Sunday at 4:25. Devontae Smith, wide receiver of the Philadelphia Eagles. Late addition to the injury report with the knee injury that flared up on Thursday. Not much information available right now for his status on Monday. You'll know more about this by Sunday morning in regards to whether he will play or not. I'm leaning towards him playing. If he does play, he's a wide receiver 2. But like I said, there's not much information in regards to his knee injury at this current point. Chris Godwin, wide receiver of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, is dealing with a knee issue that he played through this past Sunday. Obviously, big-time game, 10 receptions, 155 yards against the Packers this past week. He did not practice on Thursday, but he did practice in limited fashion on Wednesday. So it's really crucial. We have to monitor this practice status over on Friday. If he does suit up on Friday, I'd lean towards him playing in this game. If he does not suit up, if he is out yet again for practice, I'm very concerned about his playing status. If he does play, clear top 30 level wide receiver for me. Finally looked like he was able to command targets this past week. If he does play, I think he's going to be able to build off of last week's performance. And then finally, Jaden Reed. Speaking of that game against the Packers last week, we do have a Packers wide receiver himself with Jaden Reed. And right now, he's suffering from turf toe as well as what's described as rib/chest injuries. And it sounds like a painful injury that should limit him even if he does play. But fantasy doctors are very concerned at this point. Does not sound like he will be able to suit up in Week 16. Really sucks as he was coming into his own. Obviously, a young rookie player that was performing down the stretch. But if you do have Jaden Reed, be prepared to be without him this week. And even if he does play, I'd expect him to be very limited. But now we move on to the top 12 wide receivers, starting off with the 3 I'll discuss in the wide receiver 1 to 6 range. Starting off with CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver of the Dallas Cowboys, going to play on the road against the Miami Dolphins. Listed as my wide receiver 1, but like I mentioned, if Tyreek Hill plays, he will be my 1. Therefore, CeeDee would be my 2 in that instance. And with CeeDee Lamb, he really rescued his fantasy day in what was an abysmal performance for that Cowboys offense. Myself and Corey were there live in Buffalo. Very, very sloppy. Did not look like the Cowboys offense we've come to expect. But at the same time, if you did have CeeDee Lamb, like I said, was able to salvage the day with that rushing touchdown. However, I do think it's a prime bounce back performance, not only for CeeDee Lamb, but for this Cowboys offense as a whole. Nearly 25 implied points this week in a very advantageous matchup against the Miami Dolphins through the air. The Cowboys offense had an objectively off game, like I said. They did not look like that same offense that has been dominating since Week 6. But they're still clearly, in my opinion, one of the best offenses in the NFL. Big time bounce back performance in way, like I said. And oddly enough, speaking of this matchup, Tyreek Hill on the other side, the only wide receiver who's outscored CeeDee Lamb this year is Tyreek Hill. I think they're the clear-cut 1 and 2, and I do expect a lot of points to be scored in this matchup between the Dolphins and Cowboys. Highest over-under of the slate. For a reason, you have to start your studs in this instance. High-stakes game for both sides in this game. Highest over-under of the slate, like I kind of mentioned. I'm expecting fireworks to go on either way between the Cowboys and Dolphins this week. Going next, we have wide receiver 3 in my rankings, Justin Jefferson Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings, going on the road to play the Detroit Lions this week. And he finally looked healthy this past week against the Cincinnati Bengals. He commanded 10 targets, posted 7 receptions for 84 yards in last week's game. And we know he's a superstar talent. He's arguably wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2, depending on who you ask. We just really needed to see him play a game before ranking him back up in this area. 22 implied points for the Vikings this week against the Lions, despite Nick Mullins expected to start this game. Vegas is confident that he can lead a respectable offense in this matchup. Lions represent the 5th easiest matchup on the matchup chart against opposing wide receivers, and Justin Jefferson is primed to get back to his early season dominance with the Vikings playoff hopes on the line this week. Love Justin Jefferson, clear top end wide receiver 1. And wide receiver 6, a much more controversial name given how he's performed in this last month. My wide receiver 6 this week is Stefon Diggs of the Buffalo Bills, goes on the road Saturday Night Football to play against the LA Chargers. It does feel a little bit sketchy. If you have Stefon Diggs, you know how bad he's been in recent weeks. You probably wouldn't be thrilled, obviously, this past week against my Cowboys, given the circumstances. Josh Allen only throwing the ball 15 times. Only saw a 4 for 48 line in your first week of the fantasy matchups. But like I mentioned with a couple of the other guys listed, I do think this is a prime bounce back spot going against a overmatched Chargers defense this week. The Bills are the most favorable projection of the entire slate, implied for 28 points against a Chargers team that looks like I said, they're ready to pack up for the 2024 season. This is the 3rd easiest matchup on the entire matchup chart. Offense is really feeling like it has something to prove from a passing perspective after basically just dominating on the ground last week. And I do think we see this Bills offense really open up against the Chargers this week. I'm expecting big numbers. I'm expecting this offense to score over 30 points going into this game against LA. And then the other wide receiver I had in my top 6 was actually Cooper Kupp of the LA Rams. Obviously played Thursday night against New Orleans Saints. 12 targets, 6 catches, 52 yards. Very disappointing performance for Kupp. If you guys watched the game as well, he dropped 2 touchdowns that hit him right in the hands. He just couldn't come up with it. If he catches those 2 touchdowns, we're looking at potentially a week-winning play. Instead, if you did start Cooper Kupp, very disappointing 11.2 PPR points for the wide receiver 5 spot that I had him at. But moving on to my wide receivers 7 to 12, we start off with my wide receivers 8 and 12 respectively. Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs and Davante Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders. Obviously, big time matchup. Christmas Day, Monday matchup between the Chiefs and the Raiders in Las Vegas this week. And with Rashee Rice, I'm just going to start it off with him. I'm putting my money where my mouth is when it comes to him, and I'm welcoming Rashee Rice to wide receiver 1 range. Since the Chiefs bye week in week 10, he averages 18 PPR points per game and has commanded a 25% target share for the Chiefs, despite only running 73% of the team routes. Well, guess what? In the last 2 games, he has seen his routes get expanded, running 87% of the Chiefs' routes in that stretch. As long as we can continue to project Rashee Rice for this type of role, I think he has to be viewed as a fantasy football wide receiver 1. Almost 26 implied Kansas City points this week on Christmas. Raiders defense coming off a big emotional high against the Chargers the week before. I'm expecting fireworks from this Chiefs offense. And on the other side with Davante Adams, big time performance obviously with Adams, with Aiden O'Connell in that game against the Chargers. In his last 2 games, he's commanded 22 targets. And since Aiden O'Connell took over against the Giants, he is averaging 16 PPR points per game. Tough matchup this week against the Chiefs, but with Davante Adams, we know he's an elite wide receiver. We know he earns top tier volume, so I do think the offensive concerns are minimized in this aspect. Wide receiver 9 for me this week is going to be DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears, going to play the Arizona Cardinals at home this week. As we know with DJ Moore, he's an elite target commander with 40 targets in his last 4 games since Justin Fields returned to the lineup from that hand injury he suffered earlier in the season. 3 of those 4 games, he scored over 20 PPR points, and he has been the wide receiver 8 on the season, despite prolonged absence from Justin Fields this year. Now a matchup against the Cardinals where the Bears are implied for nearly 25 points as home favorites this week. And even despite a down week against the best defense in the NFL with the Cleveland Browns, we still saw DJ Moore peppered in that game with 8 targets and is the clear focal point of this Bears offense moving forward. I'm expecting a big bounce game not only for him, but for this Bears offense this week. And as we know with DJ Moore, he has an evident week-winning type of ceiling. But you need to start these guys like I mentioned in the intro, so now let's spend some more time on my wide receivers 13 to 30. Starting off with my high-end wide receiver 2s, wide receivers 13 and 15 respectively. Puka Nacua of the LA Rams and Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints obviously battled each other in last night's game between the Rams and the Saints, but we were able to see both of these players have big-time dominant fantasy football games. Starting with Puka Nacua, obviously the highlight of Thursday Night Football, 11 targets, 9 receptions, 164 yards, and a receiving touchdown in that game. Big time performance. You have Puka Nacua. You are more than likely in a very, very good position to be advancing towards your fantasy football championship. And that's not to take away anything from the big game we saw from Chris Olave as well. 13 targets. He turned into 9 receptions and 123 receiving yards. Very likely, if you have both these guys on your team, you're in a very good position of going to the championship game. But wide receivers 13 and 15, locked in there, potential week winning level plays. But we go on to my wide receiver 14, and that's Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers, going to play the Baltimore Ravens at home this week. He had a very down game by his own regards against Arizona, despite the 49ers scoring 45 points. And as you guys know, we can really thank Christian McCaffrey for that. He had 3 touchdowns. He had all the yards in that game. Hence why the Niners, despite scoring points, we saw Kittle, we saw Ayuk, we saw Debo have relatively down games by their own standards. But with Brandon Ayuk, it's a tough task this week going up against a Baltimore defense that is great at limiting opposing wide receivers. But the 49ers, though, as we know, is its own juggernaut. They're still implied for 26 points. They're still 5-point home favorites in this game. And it's the best offense in the NFL, in my opinion, for a reason. Ayuk still commands 25% of San Francisco's targets. And a potential close game where the 49ers won't be able to run it all over Baltimore, we can finally see Brandon Ayuk pop a big game that the peripherals dictate that he's due for. Wide receiver 16 for me is Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets, going to play the Washington Commanders at home this week. And he's got an elite volume all year, but now we finally get to combine that with a smash spot for the Jets. And we have a respectable 20 implied points for the Jets this week, despite quarterback incompetence. And Washington represents the single most advantageous matchup for opposing wide receivers this week. Usual expectations are as a top 25 option for Garrett Wilson. But given the matchup against Washington, I think we have to look at Garrett Wilson as a locked-in mid-range wide receiver 2, coming as my wide receiver 16. Wide receiver 17 for me is DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks, going to play the Tennessee Titans on the road this week. And with DK Metcalf, he's been extremely volatile all year, but Geno Smith is expected back after missing the last 2 games with injury. Now has the Titans on deck, who are a pass funnel defense with the second easiest matchup on the entire matchup chart. Just mentioned that Washington's number 1. Tennessee is the number 2 easiest matchup. Seahawks are implied for 22 points this week as road favorites, and I do expect this to be a bounce back spot for this entire offense, hence why I think this is a potential DK boom spot going against a Titans defense that simply can't guard him. Wide receiver 18 for me is Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins, going to play the Dallas Cowboys at home this week. And this spot in the ranking is assuming that Tyreek Hill is back. Like, if Tyreek Hill does surprisingly get ruled out, I think you have to rule up Jalen Waddle in the rankings. But assuming Tyreek Hill is back, this is still a game environment I want to be targeting on both sides. A bit of pause knowing that the Cowboys have been very good against opposing wide receivers for the most part this year. But the silver lining for Tua, for Tyreek, for Jalen Waddle, this whole offense, is that the Finns are still implied for the 4th most points on the slate, and the Cowboys defense has seeded some big plays against big time passing attacks. So with Miami, Jalen Waddle has been much more involved since the bye week. He's commanded 8+ targets in each game and has averaged over 16 PPR points in that stretch. And with that being said, I am trusting him as a locked-in wide receiver 2 this week in my fantasy football semifinals. Moving on to the low-end wide receiver 2s, we start off with T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals, going to play the Pittsburgh Steelers on the road this week. And with T. Higgins, we saw a big-time bounce back for him this past week against the Vikings. He scored 2 touchdowns, including that highlight reel where he reached behind his back, touched the pylon. That was really exciting to watch for T. Higgins, seeing him finally look like he was a healthy player after a year marred by injury. Obviously, this week, Jamar Chase did suffer that injury against the Vikings this past week, is expected out, and it's going to be a tough task going against a good Steelers secondary that could potentially limit the ceiling for this offense. But a healthy T. Higgins, on top of how well Jake Browning has been playing in Burrow's absence, gives me hope for this offense to be able to function even despite the loss of Jamar Chase. Wide receiver 20, we have Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns going to play the Houston Texans on the road this week. And Joe Flacco's resurgence could not have come at a better time for this Cleveland Browns offense, and particularly when it comes to Amari Cooper. 22 targets in his last 2 games with Flacco. Now an opportunity in a game against the Texans where Cleveland is implied for 21 points on the road. With Flacco playing the way he has been, with the neutral pass rate spiking up with Joe Flacco in the lineup, I'm expecting this Browns offense to be able to put up numbers against the Texans this week. So if you have Amari Cooper, really love his outlook this week. Despite the quote-unquote negative it is having Joe Flacco in his lineup, because he's been damn good since entering it. Wide receiver 21 is DeAndre Hopkins of the Tennessee Titans, going to play the Seattle Seahawks at home this week. And the bad news for DeAndre Hopkins is after developing that rapport he has with Will Levis in the last few games, the rookie quarterback is expected to miss this week's game against Seattle with a lower body injury he suffered last week. With Levis, Hopkins saw 33 targets in the last 3 games, and he was averaging 16.46 PPR points per game in that stretch. And Ryan Tannehill struggled earlier in the season. It caused DeAndre Hopkins to be extremely volatile for fantasy football, but the Seahawks represent an easy matchup for opposing wide receivers, and if Tannehill can get back to past year's Ryan Tannehill, we're talking 2022, 2021, 2020 Ryan Tannehill, I do think this could potentially even be a positive for DeAndre Hopkins moving forward, hence why he's still a wide receiver 2 in my rankings. Wide receiver 22, we have Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings going to travel on the road to play the Detroit Lions in an interdivisional matchup this week. Addison, big-time performance this past week in the return of Justin Jefferson, and now gets this easy matchup going up against Detroit this week. Vikings are implied for 22 points. Detroit is a top 5 matchup for opposing wide receivers this year, and despite the fact that Nick Mullins turned the ball over in this past week's game against Cincinnati, he was unafraid to throw the ball down the field. 26 completions, over 300 passing yards. We were able to see Nick Mullins just trust his wide receivers to make a play, which they were able to do all day in that game against Cincinnati. While Addison doesn't command the level of targets of some other wide receivers in this range, he's a big play threat. He's shown the ability to put the ball in the end zone, and I'm trusting this young player in my fantasy football semifinal. Wide receiver 23, we have Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos going to play the New England Patriots at home this week, and he's a very similar case to that of Jordan Addison, although on the year, Sutton has only commanded 6.1 targets per game, but as we know with Courtland Sutton, he remains one of the premier touchdown threats in the entirety of the NFL. Since the Broncos bye week, he's taken another step. He's averaging 65 yards per game and 14.34 PPR points per game since then. The downside here is that New England has been very stout against opposing wide receivers, but the Broncos are implied for over 20 points as home favorites this week. And while we can't predict touchdowns, we know that Sutton has a large amount of equity in the Broncos scores this year, so it makes sense if they score a bunch of points in this game, I expect Sutton to be able to come down with a touchdown. Wide receiver 24 is Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens going to play the San Francisco 49ers on the road this week, and it was a big-time letdown for Flowers against the Jaguars this past week. 1 catch, 7 yards, knocking some of you guys out of your fantasy football playoffs. However, if you guys were able to get past it, we still know that Zay Flowers is a good player to be able to bounce back. Prior to last week's game, he was commanding 18 targets in his previous 2, and it really looked like a fluke game against Jacksonville. I really truly believe that Zay Flowers will still be that guy moving forward, and I think it's just a blemish on the record. Obviously, we know on the other side, Niners defense does prove as a tough test for the Baltimore Ravens, but I'm expecting a very competitive game from both sides, and the Ravens need to find a way to get the ball in their most explosive playmakers' hands, and I do think with Mark Andrews out of the lineup, that guy is Zay Flowers. And despite the tough defenses on the either side, this game still has the second highest over-under of the entire slate, only trailing the Dolphins-Cowboys, and 94% of the sharp money is going on the over this week. Experts expect points to be scored, and so do I. But now we go on to my wide receiver 3, starting off with my wide receiver 25. Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons going to play the Indianapolis Colts at home this week. And the Drake London experience has been a weekly roller coaster, and we have the quarterback to blame because of that. 2 abysmal performances sandwiching a week winning one sums up just how bad the Falcons quarterback spot has been for fantasy across the season. Since the bye week, London has commanded 24% of the targets, and yet only 68% of those were deemed catchable. Despite the narrative, the Falcons are still implied for 22.5 points this week with Taylor Heineke starting. So at least Vegas still expects this offense to be functionable, and as long as this offense is functionable, I expect Drake London to be able to pay off in fantasy. Wide receiver 26 for me is Calvin Ridley of the Jacksonville Jaguars going to play on the road against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and this is under the assumption that Trevor Lawrence does not play after dealing with concussion-like symptoms after the Ravens game. That was reported. Apparently at this point, he's a 50-50 to play. If he doesn't play, this is about where I'd have Calvin Ridley. If he does play, Calvin Ridley would be a riser. So before you go down in the comments and comment how low he is, remember that disclaimer. But with Calvin Ridley, he saw another 12 targets against the Ravens this week. But if T-Law is indeed out on the road in Tampa this week, I think it's a tough spot for the overall offensive ceiling. Very advantageous matchup on the outside against a Bucs defense that struggles against opposing wide receivers. But while the implied points for the Jags currently sets at 20.75, if T-Law is ruled out, I expect that number to be closer to the 16 mark, 15.5 mark, which would make it very bad offensive circumstances for Calvin Ridley. It's very concerning. He's still the alpha wide receiver 1, but if T-Law is out, I think you have to limit his ceiling. Wide receivers 27 and 29 respectively. We have the Seahawks duo with Jackson Smith and Jigba and Tyler Lockett, both obviously traveling on the road to play the Tennessee Titans. And I mentioned the matchup when I was talking about DK Metcalf, but this is the second easiest matchup for wide receivers. And while it feels weird to have 3 Seahawks in the top 30, each, in my opinion, have a ton of upside with Geno Smith expected back in the lineup. JSN coming off that big-time high, scoring the game-winning touchdown against the Eagles on Monday Night Football this past week. And I do prefer him straight up to Tyler Lockett, but I do think Lockett has a ton of upside in this matchup in his own right. And it's more than likely it will be similar to how it's been all year, with 2 Seahawks wide receivers doing well and 1 disappointing in fantasy. But if there was a week where all 3 can shine, it would be this week in this matchup with Geno expected back. Wide receiver 28 is Deontay Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers, going to play the Cincinnati Bengals at home. And with Deontay Johnson, he's been doing some very un-Deontay-like things of late. His weekly involvement has been down. He's only commanded 18 targets and 51 yards per game in his last 3. However, on the inverse, he's been scoring touchdowns. He has 3 touchdowns in his last 3 games. This was a guy that was known for the fact that he did not score, but was heavily involved. The narrative just seemed to have switched when it comes to Deontay Johnson these last few weeks. The Bengals have ceded points to fantasy wide receivers this year. They ranked as the 8th easiest matchup on the entire matchup chart, which on paper does give Deontay a nice outlook. But the main question I have is if he can recapture that volume we saw earlier in the season. Can he go out there and command 11, 12, 13, 14 targets? In the last few games, we haven't seen that, but obviously, as we know with Deontay Johnson and given his overall profile in the past, I wouldn't be shocked if he went out there and dominated targets yet again if the touchdowns weren't coming like they have been these last few weeks. And finally, number 30, we have Noah Brown of the Houston Texans going to play the Cleveland Browns at home this week. And with Noah Brown, he had a big-time blow-up game this past week, but 2 goose eggs in the 2 weeks prior, and a daunting matchup, obviously, against the Browns with a backup quarterback at the helm this week. And in my opinion, even though the matchup is tough and the quarterback play will be bad in this game, I still think he projects for fine volume in this matchup, and he's another week removed from that knee injury that he's been dealing with. I'm not the most optimistic about the matchup, but obviously if Nico Collins does return, it does hamper his ability to produce points. But I do think as a PPR volume play and an offense that played better than expected last week with Case Keenum, I do trust Noah Brown as a flex play in my lineups this week, especially in PPR. Now, finally, we rip off my 5 deeper league flex plays like a Band-Aid, starting off with number 1. Brandon Cooks of Dallas Cowboys going to play the Miami Dolphins on the road, and he's been disappointing of late, but still has that big play upside on one of the best offenses in the league. Highest over-under game of the entire slate, and like I mentioned with CeeDee Lamb, the Cowboys are coming off that embarrassing loss against the Bills. They're typically a strong bet to bounce back after a pitiful performance like we saw from them last week. Rough showing by the passing game. I do think this is a eruption spot for this entire matchup. Gabe Davis of the Buffalo Bills going on the road to play the LA Chargers. Very similar case to that of Brandon Cooks. High upside, big play threat on a premier offense. And it's an easy matchup as Buffalo is implied for 28 points against the 3rd easiest matchup on the massive chart against opposing wide receivers. He's at a goose egg floor, but we do know that the ceiling is present when it comes to Gabe Davis in fantasy football. Third option, we got Tyler Boyd of the Cincinnati Bengals going to play these Pittsburgh Steelers on the road this week. And the big news here is that Jamar Chase obviously out with that shoulder injury. Boyd, as we've seen, he's been a good player. Anytime he has the opportunity to earn more targets in this offense when one of Higgins or Chase are out, he's typically performed, and he has the easiest matchup on the entire field working in the slot this week. So really like Tyler Boyd. Think he has very nice upside potential with Jamar Chase expected out of the lineup. Wide receiver 4, we have Odell Beckham Jr. of the Baltimore Ravens. Big time matchup on the road against San Francisco. Down week against the Jaguars, but like I mentioned with Brandon Ayuk and Zay Flowers, this is a sneaky good game environment. He's volatile, but he's commanded 22 targets in his 3 games prior to last week. So I do trust Odell Beckham Jr. as a desperation play this week. And then finally, number 5, we have Dontavian Wicks of the Green Bay Packers going on the road to play Carolina. I do think that assuming Christian Watson and Jaden Reed are both out, he is a top 30 level play on my rankings. I would rank him ahead of Noah Brown. I'd rank him ahead of Deontay Johnson. I'd rank him ahead of Tyler Lockett. But assuming one of these wide receivers does suit up, I still like Dontavian Wicks as a flex play this week. 13 targets in his last 2 games, and he saw his highest snap share of the year this past week at 78% of the snaps, depending on if he has a clear path to playing time. But if he does, he's shown he's a good player, and I want a wide receiver attached to Jordan Love with how Jordan Love has played as of late. But either way, if you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below. Comment your biggest start-sit decision. Again, it is championship week. I will try to get to as many as possible. And of course, if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button like I mentioned at the top. On the road to 40,000. Appreciate you guys. But with that being said, see you guys on Saturday. Good luck in your matchups. Take care.